today we're visiting with Brian Klingborg. I hope I'm doing that right.
Klingborg, yeah.
Klingborg, all right. That does sound much better, doesn't it? And he has a wonderful series out. I'm not even going to try to pronounce the character's name, but we're going to let Brian do that. But his first book was Thief of Souls, and it was an amazing book. And I was so delighted to see that he had another one out, which I will show at the end of the show because I've got the screen on Brian. Well Pray is your newest one.
Yep, Well Pray.
Yes, and I love the cover. For one thing, I love blue, but it's very telling about what the community is like. Tell us a little bit about your character, pronouncing his name for me so that as I read the future book, I can have that in my head, and why you chose the area that you did choose to write about.
Sure. His name is Liu Fei, which I chose because I thought it would be easy to pronounce for people who haven't studied Chinese, just like it sounds, Liu Fei.
All right.
And he's a police officer who graduated from the most prestigious police college in China and started out with a promising career in a city of Harbin, which is in the north of China, and then ran afoul of his supervisor, who he caught in a compromising position or situation, and was exiled to a small town outside the big city. So although that was a punishment, Liu Fei's actually become quite content with that situation. He feels like in that small town, he actually can make a difference in people's lives. He has a love interest there, and somehow he still manages to get in all kinds of trouble, even though he's, in the middle of nowhere. I chose that area because if you read about China, if you read about books that are written about China, or fictional books, they're mostly set in the sexy places, Beijing or Shanghai, something like that. And I wanted to choose a city that was a little bit in the hinterland to emphasize not only Liu Fei's situation at being in this exile, but also I really wanted to kind of explore what's going on in modern Chinese society, what the common person encounters with bureaucracy and healthcare, crime, things like that. So I wanted to set it in a small setting that I could more easily explore the lives of ordinary characters.
Have you visited there yourself?
I have visited China, but I've never been to the location where Liu Fei lives.
Okay. And when you visited China, was that a pleasure trip or research or what, or something else? So
when I was a junior in college, many years ago, I did an education abroad program in Taiwan. And in those days, if you wanted to study Chinese, you could go to Beijing or you could go to Taiwan. And the thing with Beijing was they would put you in a dorm with other foreigners who were learning Chinese, people from Africa or other parts of Asia or Europe. And it was very hard to get out among the people and really get around. This was in the 80s. But Taiwan was different. Taiwan, you could go to Taiwan, you could get out on the streets, you could go wherever you wanted, there were no restrictions. So I went there, and at the end of that year, I took a trip through China for about 3.5 weeks by train all around. And that was a real interesting experience. It was before China had really started to develop. It was still when you had the quote unquote iron rice bowl system where your work was kind of guaranteed and you didn't get paid anymore for working harder. So people really didn't work hard. It was a social, it was kind of like the worst aspects of a communist economy. So I did that. And then later on went to grad school, and then I went back to Taiwan. I lived there for some time, and then ended up traveling to China a couple of times after that and seeing, the great development that had taken place and the changes in society. And just, like when I went to Shanghai the first time, there were no skyscrapers. Now it's like a Hong Kong or you know, a lower Manhattan. So yeah, a lot of changes have happened in that time.
Your character at first really resented being so-called demoted, I guess the word I would use, and sent to this community, but yet found that there could be real benefit to it. But there was still some frustration in the first book.
Well, I don't think he's frustrated with being in this small town, but he feels like he's like the people who sent him there have gotten away with something, and that nags at him. He has, it's not really a revenge motive, but he likes to see people get their comeuppance when they do bad things. So he's got a bone to pick with his ex-boss, who will get his eventually, but you know, it might take some time. So that's kind of his motivation for being disgruntled.
When you did all of this, did you have an arc? Do you see where he's going as far as your books are concerned?
Not really. But so the first book was kind of a feeling out process of figuring out how I could set a mystery story in a place that I had studied and was interested in. And as I said, kind of bring to light some of these issues that I think are facing people in China. I've kind of put a human face on, you know, the person on the street in China, because here, just like in China, you're getting a lot of propaganda about what's going on over there. The governments are antagonistic toward each other. Chinese people are fed a steady stream of negative propaganda about the United States. Yet, if you go there as an American, they're very welcoming and warm. They're very curious. They're not resentful of Americans, but they perceive the United States government as disrespecting their government, trying to keep them down, trying to prevent them from being a first world power. And, you know, to some extent, they have a point. And here you're getting a lot of negative information about what's going on in China as well. So I kind of really wanted to explore that and portray people as people. So, you know, the first book came out and I did that. I tried to be didactic, but also interesting and tell a good story. And, you know, some people thought I had too much exposition in it, and some people didn't think that was the case. Can't please everybody. The second book I thought was a lot more streamlined, and you could kind of just launch into the plot without having to introduce a lot of things. You know, to be honest, the books have not sold particularly well. So my editor basically told me, you might want to think about, you know, coming full circle in the third book. So the third book has been written, and I have in fact swung around to resolve some of the storylines that began in the first, just in case there isn't a fourth. But of course, the idea is to continue the series if possible. So if the second book proves successful and we continue, then I'll be able to explore different facets of what's going on in China through the lens of mysteries that are, you know, that Lu Fei is working on.
Well, I think that's why it's so important to do events like this, where you are able to talk to the public, explain the books, and explain your reasoning for it. Sometimes people get the wrong impression. They don't want to struggle with the language or the names. And as you talk more and you, I'm sure you've been doing signings locally, they become more familiar with those things, and it's more comfortable for them.
Yeah.
It's also, for me, for someone who reads the news all the time and watches as little, I try to find something that's as neutral as possible, which is a little difficult anymore. China does not seem to be a particularly welcoming place.
Well, and you've seen this in the United States recently. You've seen it in any kind of repressive government which is seeking to control the populace. They need an enemy to unite the people. it's an old story. It's been going on since the dawn of time. The Chinese have chosen the United States as the great Satan, as we had in the Middle East with Iran,
Right.
for reasons which are imagined but also real. So yes, there is a contention between the United States government and the Chinese government. We do have conflicting worldviews. We are competing for economic and political power and geopolitical influence over the rest of the world. There's no doubt about that. There are many elements of the United States government that are seeking to, keep China down. The issue with China is that this is so. So I'm half Swedish, by ancestry. And I like to make a joke that in the 1600s, Sweden was the most powerful country in the world. And that's true because they had, quite the navy back then, but that was a long time ago.
Mhm.
China has a similar experience. At one time, they were the most advanced civilization in the world, arguably, but because of various reasons, which we probably don't need to go into, but it has to do, I think, with the fact that they always had enough human power that they didn't need to innovate as much as smaller countries did. They could always send peasants to build a wall instead of creating a machine to do that, for example. That's
Right.
just my, maybe people would argue with that. That's just kind of how I think about it. In any case, the world did at some point eclipse them and then started to, as they did during those colonial times, take bits of territory, carve it off for themselves. So the Chinese patriotic way of thinking about the world is the world has abused them to some extent and disrespected them. And they're very proud of their culture and civilization, as they should be.
Yes.
So there are some longstanding grievances, some of which are warranted and some of which I think are manufactured by the government in order to convince the people to rally around the Communist Party.
And yet and I can understand that, and yet it seems everything I buy is made in China.
Why? Because American manufacturers find it's cheaper to do that or to import those things.
Exactly. So they get a lot of business that way.
Sure.
I assume that's profitable for them from this country and probably many other countries as well. So I just find it interesting. It's kind of a contrast of reasons and feelings. But it's nice to hear that you, to this day, I assume you can travel there and still be feel that you're welcomed.
Absolutely.
As a tourist.
Yep. Just go to any public park in China. People will either be very curious and welcoming, or they'll just be kind of nonplussed about you being there. But I've never really had an issue or an unpleasant encounter because I'm an American.
Okay, that's really nice to hear. Marilyn has made the observation. She said, I think your books could be considered educational, like high school history or world history. And wouldn't we love to see schools get somewhat contemporary in the history that they teach?
Yeah, when I went to school, our history stopped just before the Vietnam War. We didn't study anything post-Vietnam War, and not much.
I don't think it's gone much further.
Right. So yeah, and so people are going to college now and not really understanding geography, geopolitics, different economic and political systems, and that ignorance is really resulting in some major issues.
Certainly. Now, in your second book, Wild Prey, what do you bring your character up against?
So Wild Prey, in the beginning of Wild Prey, Lu Fei encounters a young woman who comes into his local police station and reports her sister missing. Her sister's been working in the nearby city of Harbin as a waitress at a restaurant, and this restaurant is known for serving exotic cuisine, especially animal products, meats, and things like that, which are believed to increase virility and vitality. So it's frequented especially by men. And Lu Fei investigates and figures that something kind of untoward has happened to this waitress who worked there. Unfortunately, a lot of rich and powerful people go to this restaurant. So they shut his investigation down, and he ends up being suspended, and figures that is the end of not only his search for the missing waitress, but his career. And then he's approached by this shadowy figure from Beijing who says he's an official that's working to shut down the illegal animal trade. And he wants Lu Fei to investigate that, and in the process, perhaps find out what happened to this missing waitress, which then ends up sending Lu Fei down to Myanmar, where he infiltrates the hidden lair of this warlord. So yes, kind of a James Bondian, but to some extent reverse James Bondian plot, and it dovetails into the illegal animal trade to some extent, but not overtly the issue of sex trafficking in China, and what's going on in Myanmar to some extent. So yeah, a lot of different things.
And Myanmar, as I understand it, is really struggling financially.
Right. So Myanmar is a really fascinating place. It's the biggest landmass in Southeast Asia. It straddles China, India, Bangladesh, Laos, Thailand, and as a result, it's been invaded many times over the centuries and colonized by the British in the late 1800s, and then it achieved its independence in post-World War II, like much of Southeast Asia did after the Japanese were kicked out, and then went through some upheavals, and eventually the military engineered a coup, and it's more or less been under the control of the military ever since. But Myanmar is a place where there's all different kinds of ethnicities and religions coexisting, and sometimes agitating for more independence. So the fascinating thing about Myanmar is it's basically divided up into little fiefdoms, where some of these ethnic groups will control territory, have their own military and their own economy, and will be agitating against the government, sometimes fighting the government, sometimes a truce with the government. So it's a very unstable place. The government, the military, calls themselves socialist. I'm not sure they really know what a socialist is. Basically, they've just walled the country off for decades and reduced it to absolute poverty. And then you had a democracy movement 10 years ago, which was just recently shut down with the most recent coup. So it's a very, it's got a sad history. It's a very vibrant, interesting place, very interesting culture, but troubled, very troubled.
Mm-hmm. And I can't remember it, but it was known by a different name.
Burma, yeah.
Burma, and
Burma.
we all know that name because of the war.
Right.
And I always have to work at remembering that it's Myanmar.
Yeah, and it gets confusing. So Burma, I think, is the government officially renamed it Myanmar, and I've never traveled there. I don't speak any of the languages, and you have to be careful about, a lot of these old terms are colonial. So you don't call it by the colonial term anymore. I'm not sure if Burma was a colonial term or not, but when I wrote the original manuscript, I called it Burma, but then in the editorial process, I just changed it to the official name because that seemed the proper thing to do.
Sounds like the right thing to do.
Right.
Okay, colonial Asia, similar to Africa. Let's see. She says, I don't think many of us really understand Asia or Southeast Asian issues. And then colonial Asia, similar to Africa, ?
Yeah, definitely. In Africa, you had the Brits, the King of Belgium, who did terrible things there. And what happens is you go to the country, you exploit the resources and the people, you set up an administration in which the locals are second-class administrators or citizens. You have often a caste system. At the top, you have the forward administrators, then you have perhaps the mixed race, and then the locals, and then they agitate for freedom, but they don't really have economic or the means to create a viable economy often, and they don't have the educational resources and so on and so forth. So what ends up is something of a struggle for them to get their act together once they've removed the colonial powers.
Right. Yes, it made such a difference. They weren't prepared. Many of the areas that were under the crown at one time found themselves in the same situation.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't prepared to be free.
Right. They wanted to be free, but they didn't have the wherewithal, the mechanics to do it. Southeast Asia is very interesting because you had the British, you had the French dividing it up. The French were in Vietnam for 100 years. So yeah, there's a lot going on there. And if you go to Southeast Asia, so you go to Vietnam, for example, one of the things you'll notice as a foreigner is they have really good coffee and baguettes, French bread, and some beautiful colonial architecture. But that came at a huge cost to the local people, and a real love-hate relationship with some of the cultural leftovers from that period.
Of course, it would. As you continue with your third book, hopefully there's going to be a fourth and more. Where do you feel you're taking your character? Is he going to get his revenge? Is he going to move up in the system, so to speak?
So yeah,
without giving too much away, of course.
Sure. So he's got different story trajectories. One is his romance with his love interest in the small town. She's a widow who loved her husband and was heartbroken when he died, and so has been very reluctant to engage in a new relationship. And Lu Fei has been kind of chasing her. So that will progress one direction or the other. And in the third book, he goes back to Harbin to investigate some murders which turn out to have something to do with corruption there. And so naturally his ex-boss is at the center of that little web. And
oh, how nice.
There will be a resolution to that issue.
Okay, that's wonderful. Even if there, and hopefully there is a fourth book, that resolution would be very satisfying to everyone.
Right. I also want to, when I write these books, I try to set them within the bounds of reality, things that may actually happen. So yes, it's made up, but the political systems, the architecture, the food, for the most part, like descriptions of locations, possible interactions, the language which is spoken, all those things come from research. I don't really make any of that stuff up. I may, exaggerate a little bit or things like that. But so when I'm trying to resolve a story or an issue, I can't necessarily just, get crazy. I try to make it as realistic as possible, but also satisfying.
So I think that's what makes them such a good read, because it's not improbable. It is very possible what you do. I've enjoyed both books very much. I was pronouncing the name incorrectly, which I knew I would be. That's why I was, and of course, I didn't do well on yours. But I find that the characters become endearing and important to you as it goes forward. So it's the hope is that your publisher will realize that too. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that the books I ordered are distribute it to many hands, because I feel the more that are out there, the more chance there is of people recognizing that there's a good series going here.
Thank you.
That's very important to me. Marilyn has just got all these questions. I love it. Bridget, you're falling behind.
No, I'm just fascinated because of the stereotype we have about China, you know, the negativity, how they got locked in during COVID. And how, and yet, you know, how can they be happy?
Well, happiness is defined by your culture.
Yeah.
So
I mean, they don't know any better.
Yes, I would say, and this is oversimplifying, but the idea is that Chinese citizens have willingly relinquished the right to vote for their president and their their Congress and so on, and basically anybody above the level of a town mayor, in order to get out of poverty. So, and you have to understand, you know, China was a very poor, there's a million, you know, a lot of people there. Even today, it can still be a very poor place, but they have managed to lift millions of people out of abject poverty. And so, and this goes back, you know, to Chinese culture, which some people would call a striving culture. You work hard to accomplish things so that the next generation can do better than you, and that generation does better than that generation, and so on and so forth. You can see it when immigrants, it's not just the Chinese, many cultures have this idea.
Right.
You can see it when immigrants come to the US, the parents maybe, you know, just say, for example, have a gas station or a liquor store, but then their kids go to Columbia University and, you know, and so on and so forth. So I think Chinese people have traditionally been more focused on making their family more, more stable and healthy and profitable. And they just let the government kind of do what the government does.
Yeah,
But
because here I live in Irvine, and
Yep.
of course, California is the Pacific Rim. And of course, the Chinese government even put a ban on Chinese bringing more than $50,000 into our country or something like that. Because in Irvine, Chinese people are buying homes in cash. And we're talking about $1 million homes. They want to leave. And I heard that Orange County is de rigueur to go to move to in California. So this is all very interesting about this culture. I'm really intrigued to see what really the everyday person really thinks, because it's not what we perceive. And I don't know if that's all propaganda.
Well, and I think the people that come and buy those homes are extremely wealthy ones.
Well, but they also have, I had a friend in Monterey Park, and there's kind of like, I don't know, like Brian was saying, I want to say like the Chinese mafia, they fund each other. They borrow from each other to build. It's like a Ponzi scheme almost.
I think that's typical of many immigrants from communities. I come from Chicago originally, and you have the Italians in one neighborhood and the Irish in another, and they help each other.
Right.
There was I don't know the term, but there is what you're talking about is particularly popular among Korean immigrants, maybe 20 or 30 years ago. So what would happen is an immigrant would come over, he would make some money, somebody else would come over, and those immigrants would all pool their money in order for one guy to open a business. But that guy would then pay that forward. So, you know, it wasn't any kind of extortion or anything. It was kind of a self-help situation that was going on. So yeah, that's what that's about.
We've seen that very much in the Vietnamese community here in California. They work very hard and start off with nothing and build themselves a life and see that their children are educated. So it's very positive thing.
Yeah, my my wife, who I met when I was 18 at UC Davis, she was on the 3rd floor and I was on the 2nd floor of the dorm, is Vietnamese, left in 75, you know, 3 days before Saigon fell. Grew up in Hong Kong, went to an American school. So like she's culturally pretty American, yet, you know, there's a real core of Vietnamese there.
Of course.
And she left in 75 and we didn't go back until the 90s because things were unstable. And I went back with her the first time, I think she was 28. So she hadn't been there for 20 years. Anyway, long story short, the American government allowed her uncle, who served in the South Vietnamese army and was in a re-education camp, to immigrate. So he came over with his wife 20 years ago with 2 kids who didn't speak a lick of English. And he was a, you know, captain in the military. He was a math teacher in the high school. You know, he was somebody of some prominence, education, and he delivered newspapers and he worked in a factory making boxes. His wife did the same thing. And those kids both went to UC Berkeley.
Right.
And, you know, one's an engineer and one's a nurse. So that to me is kind of the American dream and what you see with people.
Well, and I admire that kind of ambition and drive.
Oh, there's no doubt they're hardworking.
Yes. And I just admire that they help each other. And China for such a long time had, and I don't think they still do, the rule of just one child.
Right. They did, and they recently, because their birth rate was going down so quickly, which then, of course, who's going to take care of the older people? You know, if you aren't working and paying your taxes and so on, they eliminated that. In the past, if you lived in the countryside and you had a farm, you could have more than one child.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes you could petition if you had a girl, you could petition to have another child to see if you could get a boy. But for a period of time, there was forced sterilization and abortions and a huge amount of abuse that was going on around that, infanticide and so on and so forth. But now it's loosened up. But the problem now is that Chinese youth are so overworked and exhausted and trying to make ends meet that they don't even date, let alone get married and have kids. And, you know, they're getting married later. There's still societal pressure to have children, but women, and you know, this is something you see in developing countries. Women are getting educated and they're becoming professionals, and so they're getting married later, and then sometimes they'll choose their career over having kids.
Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Fascinating, all of it. I'm looking to see if we have any more questions here. What do you hope to say that this series has to maybe be set aside for another book that you might write? Hopefully not abandoned, but just like so many authors do. They'll write X number of books in a certain series and then they go off and do something different. Mm-hmm. If you were to do that, what would you think you might want to write?
Well, that's tough because any writer who spends 8 to 12 months writing a book wants it to sell, you know.
Oh yes, no, I you know, saying that they sell,
right?
But you wanted to step out of character for just one book.
Well, I had an idea that was the precursor to Thief of Souls. But in the same vein. So that was set in Vietnam right before the Tet Offensive. And I wanted to talk about, you know, I wanted to have a character who was a Vietnamese police inspector, a guy who worked for the CIA. And in that world, you would have the US military, the CIA, you would have the Vietnamese, the Viet Minh or the Viet Cong. You would have all different kinds of interesting things going on in Saigon, you know, and it would be a mystery series set in Saigon, but in amongst that world with all these different characters, you know, going around. But, you know, now I second guess that. I'm not sure what the appetite is for that. I would have thought that a book coming out about Chinese police inspector in China, which is hopefully giving you kind of a local view of what's going on, would be something that people would really be interested in at this point in time, where, you know, the US and China are really vying for supremacy. The world is changing, and it's, you know, there's a lot going on.
Right.
So, you know, I don't know. I'm interested in history. I'm interested in Asia, but I would also consider doing, another idea I had was talking about the role of women in the CIA in the 60s, because in those days, they were mostly secretaries and they had to show up wearing little hats and white gloves. But some of them were determined to be operatives, and they, by hook and crook, managed to do so and became very good at what they were doing, because they had different ways of perception. One anecdote is when women were finally able to be undercover operatives, they could always tell when they're in Eastern Europe or Europe, they could always tell who the KGB was by looking at their socks. And the comment was like, a guy would never notice that, you know? So I find that very interesting, and I would like.
I think it would be, yes.
I hope nobody will see
options.
this and steal this idea.
Well, we'll hope not. You had it first. But no, it does sound interesting. And a departure sometimes brings life to a previous book.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
It really does. Do we have any more questions for Brian before we let him go here? It says, no, not so much. One of the last comments is, how about writing a series about Afghanistan? I think that would be even more of a challenge.
Yeah, I don't know anything about it, so I would have to, at least with these ideas, I've been the Asia thing, I've been around it since I was, you know, academically and living abroad, so I've had my hand in it for a while.
Yes, it's much easier to create something that is real when you are so familiar with it. I think that's very true. We'd love to see you back with the next book.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this has been wonderful. Your books are very good. We all know it's hard to get noticed. It's hard to build things up, and publishers, they're in such chaos right now anyway themselves. I have trouble getting books delivered. I have trouble having orders completed. They're just in a world of hurt themselves.
Yeah, I will say I have no complaints about Minotaur. They've done a great job. They've done everything they can. You just have to have the audience that connects with the material, and of course nobody knows what's going to sell and what's not. You know,
no,
so that's just how it goes. But I have no complaints about how they've handled it. They've done great.
Minotaur and whatever the company is over them has always been right there with their authors, and like doing really remarkable covers for them. And
yeah, fantastic.
I love this cover. In fact, I'm going to put us back on whatever a gallery, I guess it is, and show off the covers. There we are. Okay, so we have, this is the second book, Wild Prey. And as everybody knows, blue is my favorite color. I'm doing this very well. There we go. And then his first book was very different. It was red and black, and showing the small houses and the way they go up the hills, which I thought was very intriguing. Both very much worth reading, very informative as well as entertaining. And it's hard to combine the two. It's definitely not an easy thing to do. I want to thank you so much for your visit with us today. I wish you all kinds of luck. We'll want to see you back with whatever you choose to write for the next one.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I will definitely come back and see you when book 3 comes out. Yes, and hopefully, even though you're all the way in New York, maybe you'll be traveling across the country. And I always extend this invitation. If you're ever in Southern California, let me know and we'll always do something. Great. Love to.
It's a lot of fun to be spontaneous.
Right. And I can, I can visit my parents. They're in Sacramento, but yeah, I'll just take a trip through.
It's only 400 miles away.
Yeah,
you
hop,
know.
skip, and jump away.
Exactly. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's really great. Thanks so much,
Thank you.
Brian.
Thank you.